The White House has postponed its briefing with the Gang of Eight, a group of top lawmakers, over the alleged Russia-Taliban bounties on U.S. service members in Afghanistan as Congress and the American people try to figure out exactly who knew what and when. White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany is disputing the claims that the president is in the dark on such matters.
The president does read, and he also consumes intelligence verbally. This president, I'll tell you, is the most informed person on planet Earth when it comes to the threats that we face.
All right, let us bring in Katrina Mulligan. She's the Managing Director for National Security and International Policy at American Progress. Katrina, you just heard Kayleigh McEnany, the President of the United States, is the most informed human on planet Earth. You've also worked in the Justice Department, National Security Council, and Office of the Director of National Intelligence under President Obama and President Trump. So give us a sense of how intelligence is collected, how it's vetted, and ultimately how it is briefed to the president, the vice president, and members of Congress. I mean, the question that I think everybody is trying to understand here is if this information was in the president's briefing. I guess the first question is, even if it was unverified or there were competing or different perspectives from members of the National Security Agency or the intelligence community, wouldn't the president still be briefed about what that intelligence is?
In a normal administration, it absolutely would. Look, it is not the case that intelligence is always withheld from the president if there isn't unanimity of viewpoints within the intelligence community. That's been the administration's latest claim, but I personally know it to be inaccurate. It is instead the case that the uncertainty that is always baked into intelligence is the responsibility of the administration to manage. The IC's role is to explain to the administration what they know and what they don't know and where the gaps are. And then it is up to the president to make the tough calls about what should happen. So in this situation, if the president didn't know what he needed to know, then that's a huge failure, not of the intelligence community, but of his national security staff. And if he did know and he didn't take action based on a threat of this severity, then that raises a whole different set of questions about what he is prioritizing. Because if it's not our troops, then what is it?
Okay, so I want to sort of dig into something that you talked about, the lack of consensus between intelligence departments, and you said it's sort of like baked into the process. So CBS News has learned that the CIA and the NSA sort of differed on their understanding of the seriousness of these allegations. Just flesh that out for us. How significant is that two agencies would have different conclusions on the information that they're getting if they're all getting the same information?
So I haven't seen this particular report, of course, but my understanding of where the disagreement existed wasn't in the severity of the claim, but in the confidence level, how confident the intelligence community was that the information was accurate and was complete. And so that is not an unusual thing. I mean, it's actually very, very common. In fact, there's a formal process within the intelligence community to to offer a dissent if you aren't sure or if you think there's a point that requires clarification. There's almost like think of a text box in an intelligence report that says this is the general consensus of the majority of the intelligence community, and this one agency has a different viewpoint. And the differing viewpoints are presented to the president and to senior White House policymakers, and it is up to them to reconcile and to weigh the information they're getting from the intelligence community with information they're getting elsewhere.
You know, it just strikes me, Katrina, that through the course of American history, presidents have always been faced with situations like this. I mean, we can probably spend an hour talking about the decisions and the options that were presented to Franklin Delano Roosevelt during World War II with regards to things as monumental as the invasion of Normandy to how to treat intelligence, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Iranian hostage crisis, whether or not Osama bin Laden was in that compound in Pakistan. I'm sure there were competing narratives for the President of the United States to take into account, and then for the president to make a decision. Do we move or do we not move? Do we attack or do we not attack? Do we wait? Do we work on this intelligence or do we not work on this intelligence? So I just find it, I think that Americans are struggling to understand this process. And in this op-ed from the New York Times, former National Security Advisor Susan Rice details her concerns over how intelligence was conveyed to the president. She asks if, quote, the president was, here's the quote, if President Trump was told about Russian actions, why did he not respond? If he was not told, why? Are his top advisors utterly incompetent? Are they too scared to deliver bad news to President Trump, particularly about Russia? Is Mr. Trump running a rogue foreign policy, utterly divorced from U.S. national interests? If so, why? So these are the questions. That's a quote from Susan Rice. So given the president's relationship with Vladimir Putin, how does this complicate the handling of this particular piece of intelligence?
Look, every president wants to have 100% certainty about the intelligence before they make a move. When I was in the National Security Council staff, I also always wanted there to be more certainty than there actually was when we were having to make decisions. It is not the case. You don't get 100% certainty when you're making the really tough calls. You don't get to have all the confidence in the world that you're making, that you know everything that is potentially relevant. You get the hand that you're dealt and you have to make decisions based on it. I think what Susan Rice said in her op-ed is absolutely right. It's certainly what I saw when I was working on the National Security Council staff. We were having to deal with, when I was there, we were dealing with the Snowden disclosures, and we didn't know what was coming next, and we didn't know all the information that he had stolen in the beginning. And so, we had to make decisions based, in the absence of perfect information. That is the job. That is the job of the President of the United States. And if the president, in this case, thinks that that he isn't responsible for making these decisions in the absence of perfect unanimity of the intelligence community, well, that is not. That's not the job as I understood it when I was working in the White House.
The Trump administration has blamed members of the intelligence community for leaking this whole bounty report. Others are watching too, allies, but also enemies around the world. I'm wondering, what are the potential implications as others watch not only information about how the president is briefed, how the president takes the information in, whether or not those around him are being honest with him? I mean, what are other countries thinking and saying, do you think?
I mean, look, leaks are never a good thing. They are harmful they can be harmful to our national security, whether you have a Republican or a Democrat as president in any administration. I in general oppose leaking as the way to get information out. But I would also say that there's honestly no leak of information that's done more damage to our country than what President Trump has already done by his actions, by his embrace of authoritarian leaders, by his own words and deeds. And so to some extent, the real harm to our national security as people are watching this episode is coming from the president's complete inaction when it comes to responding to this threat. He hasn't reassured our troops yet. In fact, Secretary Esper had to do that just last night. He hasn't said anything to reassure Americans that he's taking this seriously, and he certainly hasn't done anything to signal to the Russians that there's going to be any kind of consequence for this, which, honestly falls just short of an act of war. So, I mean, that the most damaging thing in this scenario isn't that the information has come to light. It's that even with the information coming to light, the president still refuses to act.
Right, and that was sort of going to be my wrap-up question to you, Katrina. I mean, yes, Secretary Esper has mentioned it, has talked about soldier, Marine, sailor, airman safety. But the President of the United States has not. He has always in his tweets and in his sort of grandstanding talked about the troops and how, important it is for him to be President of the United States because the military so appreciates him. If I had a loved one who was serving in Afghanistan and this intelligence, whether it is accurate or whether there are details missing from it, meant that any American life had been lost by actions taken by Russia and Vladimir Putin, and that the United States was not figuring out a way to strike back or hit back, whether in the form of sanctions or other, I would be very, very concerned. And if I was in uniform, I would wonder what the commander-in-chief was thinking. Should the commander-in-chief say something or do something? Is there anything, if you were still working in the administration, what would you recommend to the President of the United States? What kind of action he should take based on this intelligence that Russia was paying bounties to Taliban-affiliated groups to take out American servicemen?
Look, there is honestly nothing, no threat, no piece of information that I came into contact with while I was in the White House that was more concerning than this threat stream is that we're now seeing aired out in the public domain. And I wouldn't have had to have a conversation about it. It would have been people tasking me to develop options for the president to put together, a plan. This isn't the kind of thing that I would have had to beg for people to pay attention to. And so the entire dynamic that's happening in this White House is really difficult for me to wrap my head around, given the experiences that I've had. But look, there's just nothing more sacred than our responsibility to the men and women in uniform. And the truth is, whether I had a loved one in uniform or not, as an American, I'm deeply troubled by the fact that that our president just isn't willing to go out there and say, "I support you. We're gonna protect and defend you." But the other thing that's just kind of a gap in what we understand about the intelligence so far is we don't know if this was, a retrospective, past tense type of threat, or whether it's ongoing. For all we know, there are still bounties on the heads of U.S. soldiers serving overseas. And if that's the case, it's just hard for me to emphasize how completely unacceptable that is, and how disappointing it is to see a president not take that seriously.
Katrina Mulligan, really interesting discussion, a lot to think over, a lot to mull over. I'm sure our audience will be doing that based on your remarks. Thank you very much, Katrina.
You're welcome. Thanks.